county basis. And so you have many, many, many maps. And each one of these you can see is a segment that just goes through this particular county. This is Cambria County. And so you want to be able to understand the big picture of this. First, you need to stitch together all the maps. You want to understand how many waterways this crosses. You have to somehow stitch together the many, many Excel, printed out spreadsheets that are in PDF form that are not posted on the website. You have to go down and schedule a time to view the paper documents, et cetera, et cetera. This is changing some, and it has changed since, and I'll talk about this in a moment. But the complication is that by the time you actually get a sense of this project, it's already out the door. Now, some really interesting thing happened. I was on the Environmental Justice Advisory Board for the state of Pennsylvania between 2016 and 2018. And one of the cases that I was making is that data is critical to environmental justice, right? Maps, GIS data, transparency, information transparency the public has greater capacity to be able to work with this stuff than you give them credit for. And our definition of public participation is far outdated based on the level of expertise that exists in the public in the present time. And I kept making the case, like, we need to have GIS data layers for Mariner East. Why isn't this stuff available? At this time, they had posted PDF versions of the pipeline, but it was, long into the public comment period at that point. And a very strange thing happened. A colleague of ours in another environmental nonprofit had somehow negotiated with the assistant director of a different agency in the state to give them all of the GIS data and whatnot, and saying, of course you guys should have this. And so then the next meeting that I went back to the DEP, I said, I don't really need that because we've got it from another agency. And like 3 days later, they posted it on their website saying, the caveat saying, don't expect this in the future. It was just sort of a one-shot deal. And so then we had the data, but it was only released about a week prior to the public comment period closing. And so we didn't really get a chance to do anything actionable with it, But we found out some really interesting stuff once we started to churn through this. One of the interesting things that I'm trying to unpack are what are the primary questions that people want to ask of this data around pipelines once they get a handle on it. And the very first thing that people want to, I find, discover is what's the blast zone? What's the imminent risk of this thing having an accident and then people having a public health crisis as a result of it? And so the very first thing that my organization at that time was asked to do was a blast zone analysis of this pipeline. And we got lucky in that there was a industrial engineer that was based in a community rights organization just east of Harrisburg that was, calculating all of this. And so, we started to co-publish some maps that illustrated this. I think we found something like 40 schools were within the blast zone, significant number of populations, 3 environmental justice zones in the state. And this got picked up by a lot of media, including the Philadelphia Inquirer. They did this really interesting thing. These groups went off and they created these lawn signs and started to put them in all of the people who would be willing to do so, put it in the yard of the people who were in the blast zone. And the optics of this were pretty significant. And when they had the midterm elections, they flipped 3 municipal elections to municipal boards that were in favor of opposing the pipeline. So it had direct election consequences too. Other things that came out of the data was the ability to track impacts and do violation incident tracking and vet whether or not state agencies were accurately keeping track of all the various spills and drilling mud incidents and crossing of waterways that were happening and having problems. And so they're started to develop this whole sort of citizen surveillance thing around the data. And this has had some really major impacts. This particular ability to use the data has had some pretty significant impacts. A number of interventions on the part of organizations like the Clean Air Council, significant fines, and then as it stands, they're not able to build a pipeline. So they're sort of piecing together the parts that they have built with the original Mariner 1 to get something that they can get ethane out the door. And they've told their investors that we really don't know when it's going to be completed at this point. Now, excuse me. Second quick case study on this is I started to get really interested in what would happen if you had data well in advance, like prior to any kind of permitting project. And those questions came later, but there's a very large petrochemical facility that Shell is building north of Pittsburgh, an ethane cracker that will take ethane and turn it into ethylene to produce plastics. And was very obvious that we got to the late stages in which it appeared that the permits were getting approved, and the environmental advocacy community was feeling pretty frustrated about this. And so we were asked, I wonder if we could find something about the pipeline. Like, they're going to need a pipeline to get this thing operational. And so, like any good researcher does, I go out to Google and just type in Falcon pipeline GIS shapefiles, and lo and behold, the engineering firm that we contracted to do this project didn't password protect any of their ArcGIS servers. And so it was all just sitting on the internet. We consulted with a slew of environmental attorneys and digital rights attorneys to make sure that we weren't going to get nailed on this, and they said, you're good to go. And so we went through the process of very arduously, manually recreating all of this stuff. And found we were able to do some really interesting stuff with this data. Now, this was about a year and a half before they ever submitted their permit applications. First thing that we did is we created walk sheets so that people could go through and identify landowners that had not yet signed easements to invite them to educational workshops so they could understand their rights as landowners. Took a lot of notes about what their concerns were so that we really understood the nature of why they would or would not sign a pipeline easement. We had 3 workshops that were held as a result of that. We also started to find some really critical places at which the pipeline may be questioned or perhaps had a higher risk of public health impact, environmental impact than others. One of the more important ones we discovered is that it was going to cross through the headwaters of a drinking water reservoir as well as cross the raw water line that supplied now 9 municipalities. We brought all the maps to the water authority manager, and I said, here you go, what do you think about this? And they were, wow, we didn't even know this was happening. And they issued this very public statement, and it galvanized the communities, and the DEP paid attention to this. That in particular, they had to pay attention to. And then once the permits were submitted, at that point, we had already gone through so much of the data analysis that when the permits were submitted, we just needed to double check it to make sure that we were accurate. We just needed to fill in some of the blanks. And then about a week after, we produced this on the Frac Tracker website, which was the Falcon Public EIA project. Breaking it down in the same way, we did basically a full NEPA review of this project. There was only a scant amount of this information that needed to be submitted to the DEP to get their permits, but yet on the back end, they had essentially done the full EIA. And so we published the full EIA that Shell was doing. And with some interesting results. For one, the DEP had to triple the number of months in which they had to, they extended the public comment period by an additional 3 months, had 3 public hearings, issued a series of technical deficiency letters to the company based on a lot of the findings that we had produced and made available to them. And as it stands, they're still reviewing the permits, and we're not sure exactly what's going to happen. One of the things that I'm really interested in as this moves forward is, will it make any difference? Having this thing, a year and a half in advance, right? At the end of the day, will Mariner East and the Falcon look any different at the end of the day, right? Did we make some sort of, substantive changes in terms of risks, but are there any bigger, broader interventions that we were able to make as a result of this? Oops, this thing just zipped forward here quite a lot. Now, meanwhile, back on the Mariner East in the last couple of months, some really interesting things have happened. A settlement with the DEP, because of all the fines, has made it such that the DEP is now going to commit to doing more transparency around all the documents for permitting prior to public comment opening, and they haven't specifically said GIS data, but it's possible that that may happen. They're going to open up a new public advisory committee, and they're going to be reviewing all the permitting processes. A really interesting development, and so the scaling up of this is that organization that we had worked with previously when I was still at Frac Tracker. They have since gone on, that concerned citizen group that was interested in doing the blast analysis has gone on to crowdsource $60,000 to hire a company that does EIAs for the oil and gas industry to produce their own EIA to counter what was coming out of state agencies. And this is the result of that. And they've been going on campaign with this and making some really interesting. They've already convinced the county to do an EIA. As a response of their sort of citizen EIA, and then the county is taking that to the DEP and asking the DEP to do an EIA that they hadn't done previously. Now, I've been observing these technical practices and these engagements with data in a whole range of different places besides these 2 projects that I've been involved in. Another really interesting one is around the Atlantic Coast Pipeline that actually just got shut down, sort of indefinitely 2 days ago because the Army Corps suspended all their water crossing permits. I argue that one of the reasons why, if this was litigated by the Sierra Club, and one of the reasons I think this has happened is because of these technical engagements with these projects. And so this is a group called the Allegheny Blue Ridge Alliance, and they have something called the Pipeline Compliance Survey Initiative and the Pipeline Air Force, in which they've trained all of these drone pilots to go and document the changes that are happening on the land. And their interface is really sophisticated in a lot of different ways in which you can cut through this data. But again, this is post-construction. This project is underway, and they're doing all this analysis afterwards. And I just want to know, what can we do prior to this, right? And so in conclusion, I'm seeing what I call these sort of critical environmental impact movements emerge in order to make sense of these really complex environmental threats. They're accounting for externalities beyond typical EIAs. They're doing this by building infrastructure for long-term public engagements, technical infrastructures, social infrastructures, resource infrastructures, right? And they are rearranging power. And I think that just what I've presented in the few case studies today are giving evidence of that. However, they also significantly depend on timelines and accessibility of data, varying levels of a coalition's resources and expertise. A phenomenon that I find really interesting about pipelines from a social movement's perspective is that you have, say, a 600-mile-long pipeline that cuts across 3 states, as in the case of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. And you have vast areas in which you're talking about significant rural poverty issues, people who are not necessarily invested in opposing energy infrastructure projects, perhaps because of economic reasons and they may benefit from. But yet you have, all it takes is one really active group that has resources and expertise to do something like what I'm talking about today to shut down the entire project, right? And so there's 2 things about that are interesting. One is the disruption of how vulnerable these projects are to individual disruptions. And that's really interesting from a strategic point if you're an environmental justice movement. But also the capacity of these projects to bring together environmental justice movements that perhaps would never have been possible previously, right, across broad socio-demographic difference. If you can develop common cause in opposing projects for various reasons, pipelines offer a way to do this in ways that I think prior infrastructures did not, or opposition to prior energy infrastructures could not. And then, of course, another factor in this is the ability to intervene at multiple scales of governance. If you have the capacity to be able to participate and contest and protest and be critical of the federal level at NEPA as well as the state and on the local level, there's more opportunities in which you can throw a wrench in the works, essentially, if you're trying to oppose these projects. Whereas if you're just dealing with the state level, then you're only honed in on those few permits and what can you actually do within those particular permits. But the big question is ultimately, whose job is this anyway, right? I mean, this whole sense of neoliberalizing, environmental regulation and violation inspections and, tracking whether or not there's sedimentation issues and on and on and on and on, it's not our job, right? This is the job of our agencies. This is the reason why they exist, is these institutions are supposed to be protecting the public interest, public health interests, environmental impacts interests. And so, while this is fantastic, and I think it's very exciting stuff, and it's building capacity for people to be able to interact with their institutions in new ways, at the same time, we cannot use this as justifications, for instance, with the CEQ to say, well, the public has all of this accessible technology now to be able to engage with NEPA, and so therefore we can scale back all of these various ways in which we think about public participation, because the reality is that the agencies are not creating that, the public is creating it, right? And so it's a flip, it's a reversal of the ways in which we're seeing these resources develop, and I don't think this is unusual to this particular case. We're seeing it across the board. So, with that said, I hope I introduced some interesting fodder for conversation, and I thank you for coming. You can see my contact information here, and I just want to open it up to questions. Yes?
These, one sec, we're going to
pass
the microphone around.
Sorry, yeah, there's a microphone.
Capture things.
And if you could introduce yourself before your question, that'd be great.
My name is Dave Onspach, no affiliation. Do you know how these environmental groups have all these resources to tie up these projects like that? Are all their resources private and voluntary? They're not getting any subsidies from government or anything like that, is that correct?
They are not getting, well, it's very complicated. I mean, these are broad coalitions. It's not just a dozen people that are operating out of their homes. So for instance, with the projects that I was discussing, there's a whole infrastructure of organizations that are involved. Concerned citizen groups that are crowdsourcing $60,000 to be able to fund things like independent EIAs. Technical service providers, capacity building organizations, no different than Frac Tracker, that come in with all these technical skills to assist them. You have the litigators, the Sierra Clubs, the Clean Air Councils, the NRDCs of the world, that come in and help with all of that really legal assistance that's necessary. Certainly when you're dealing at the federal level and how complex things like NEPA litigation can be. And so there's resources coming in at all levels. And the money that comes into that, of course, are from foundations, from private donors, from individual citizens. And so,
So not government subsidies though, right?
No, it's interesting though, there is a space of involvement in which so for instance, the Pipeline Safety Coalition is an organization in Pennsylvania. And they have received, and most of what they do is education around pipeline safety. There's another organization called the Pipeline Safety Trust. They have gotten awards in the past, grants in the past from PIMSA to do public education around pipeline safety. And so to an extent, there's subsidy in the space in which government agencies want to see public involvement in a better understanding of these projects. But then as you can see, that education can have two sides to it, right? People become educated and suddenly they become more empowered too.
My name is Jim Casey. I'm a local attorney. Great presentation here. I appreciate hearing what you have to say. I've been doing research on opposition to highway programs now for over 20 years. Mm-hmm. And what I'm seeing here is really a high-tech version of what community groups were able to do in killing freeways, starting in the late 60s through the 70s, when a lot of my colleagues in the transportation agencies had to take years to revise and redraft environmental impact statements because the U.S. government was changing the guidance to the state transportation departments on what should be in an EIS. And I think what got lost in that original citizen opposition was the fact that every public program, it can be the pipelines, it can be the highways, it can be overhead lines, there's always costs. And so when opponents to freeways say, we can't build these highways because there are costs, all that we can do is mitigate the cost. And so I think probably what you see now in the last, President Trump has talked about streamlining the EIS process, is from 3 decades of experience that individuals, in a far less high-tech area than exists now, and the internet did not exist in 1971, but they were able to frustrate and cost the public much money and much efficiency over decades, and that can't be quantified in quite the same way that you can get 50 landowners within 100 feet of a highway project to say, oh my God, we can't have the highway here because noise is going up 2 decibels, okay? Or you can't expand a runway at Chicago O'Hare because you're gonna do this unless you buy off every landowner and put $30,000 in soundproofing into their homes. So I see the replay now with the rise of the environmental justice movement, which is also active against highway projects in the United States. I grew up in Milwaukee. They're active there against the Wisconsin DOT. I see that. And so I guess the question is, where is the whole thought of the conception of the public good? Has that been lost by morphing everything into census tracts and GIS mapping? Because, quite frankly, you can stop any project now. Who cares about what the public, or what it's going to mean 50 years from now? And if the population of the United States goes up by 50 million in the next 40 years, let's say, it'll make it even harder to get anything built in this country because you're going to be impacting simply more people based on demographic trends. So I guess what does that say for the future from your perspective in terms of all these major public programs, either in-state or interstate, and what does that mean for the future of the country?
Sure, yeah, I can answer that. The mantra of my school at ASU, the School for the Future of Innovation and Society, is that the future is for everyone, and not just for the few who can afford to have the future that they want, right? Starting with the highway projects, right? I think that one of the things that gets lost when we talk about the highway projects of the 1960s is that most of them demolished poor, mostly people of color neighborhoods. And so when you talk about, oh, people complain about highway projects, you know, those people don't exist anymore because their neighborhoods were demolished and they got scattered because they were essentially redlined, right? So I think that when we talk about due process and we talk about environmental justice, and you're right, the environmental justice movement emerged from the civil rights movement, is equal impacts and distributional impacts. And you know, why is it that we have underpasses through wealthy neighborhoods but overpasses in poor neighborhoods? And I think that that's a legacy that we have from the Eisenhower highway system over the years. So in saying that, what I mean is that having public discussion about the benefits of technology, whether it be highways or pipelines, is critical. And one of the consequences of us narrowing in on things like, should it be this watershed or that watershed, or should we use this erosion control method or that erosion control method, is that it does not think about environmental justice, does not think about whose community, whose values are getting, you know, marginalized and whose are not, right? And the reality is that money talks and power talks, and so most of these projects move in the direction of the people who have the power to make it move in the direction that they want, whether it be a pipeline route or a highway route. One of the things that I brought up in the very first or second slide were some of the opposing logics. Something that those of us who've been studying the extraction industry for a number of years, and I've been in it for about 10 years now, is that there was a dramatic shift in public perception and public acceptance of, you know, the fracking industry, of pipelines, when it was about energy independence, when it was about developing resources for, you know, the American citizens, bringing down gas prices. Gas prices were the highest last winter that they've been in like 5 years, even though we've got more energy than we know what to do with right now. So, you know, the logics of that are breaking down. But on top of that, when we started to see a shift to export terminals, the approval for the first time of LNG export as opposed to import terminals in the United States, when we started to see this idea of energy dominance, using it as a tool of, you know, foreign policy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, people said, well, wait a minute. You know, back when I started working in Pennsylvania, there used to be billboards that said, drill a well, bring a soldier home, right? That's gone now. It's, you know, drill a well and, you know, tell Russia to get lost, or, you know, whatever it might be, right? And that has changed, right? It has changed in the sense that people have a stake as to why these projects should exist, and perhaps they should go to the negotiating table to figure out how it could potentially benefit everybody. To one, if people said, wait a minute, this is about money, this is about power, this is about private investors, this has nothing to do with me. And that has absolutely turned people against the industry in a different way.
Thank you. Sharon Buccino. I work as an attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council. One thing, several things jumped out at me, but one thing I'd like to drill down into a little bit is, so the power of the information, the GIS shape files you got ahead of time. And it gets my legal mind thinking, you know, what are the possible ways to leverage and get access to that information earlier. And I guess a lot of times one of the issues is going to be, well, one, the agency may declare it as like deliberative until they put it out as a draft EIS, as part of a draft EIS. They may not even include it as part of the draft EIS. A lot of circumstances you have the applicant paying a consultant, the company, Energy Transfer, paying the consultant to develop the initial version of a draft environmental impact statement. And so that adds an additional challenge. But I think there's probably some room to try to move, maybe take advantage of this desire to make the review process more efficient, to say, I mean, look, the communities don't want process just for the sake of process. I mean, we're advocating for more efficiency. And if you're giving information, maybe part of that is giving the community the information, you know, early enough to engage in the process effectively and focus the agency on the issues that really matter to the community. So that's an area that I'd be interested in exploring further, and I don't know if you have further thoughts on that.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that I discovered when I was advising on the DEP, Environmental Justice Advisory Board, is that, you know, of course I'd have conversations with other people in the agency. And something that I discovered in talking to people who were in the, you know, data management division, they were the ones that were the stewards of all the GIS data projects that they were overseeing, is that they get GIS shapefiles for pipelines all the time in the permit applications. In fact, they have to. You know, the public released stuff tends to be the PDF documents, but you know they share it around. They have to share it with the state, you know, fish and wildlife groups, et cetera, to make sure that it, you know, it compares to their indexes of locations of endangered species and all these kinds of things. And so the data is getting shared around internally, but there's been no mandate to share it with the public as well, right? And something that we observed in states that have, you know, really ramped up oil and gas production, I'll take Pennsylvania as an example, is if you go back, say 2010, the state had no commitment to transparency of even releasing the locations of wells, well pads, or where violations were occurring, et cetera. So, and it's not because they were trying to hide that, they just didn't have any, you know, demand for it. They hadn't built the infrastructure for it. They hadn't figured out who would be the steward of that, who would manage it long term. Did they have the computer systems for it? Did they have the funding and the resources, people, et cetera, et cetera? And of course, as we know, every agency is understaffed and under-resourced. After various public interest groups hammering them and hammering them and hammering them over the years, Pennsylvania has one of the most sophisticated online presences of being able to share that data with the public of any state in the country. What I'm hoping we're seeing here is the same evolution of that process around pipelines, right? I think it's safe to say that the production and the availability of all that data around oil and gas drilling hasn't stopped oil and gas drilling in Pennsylvania. There's over 10,000, you know, fracking wells in Pennsylvania now. Compared to 2010, there were far fewer. So it's not to say that these will stop pipelines, but they will certainly allow for transparency. And I think that that's part of what people want. Getting back to what would be the value of that on an earlier stage, one of the things that I saw very interesting in watching the data around the Falcon pipeline in particular evolve over time is that there were many routes that were being looked at. They were surveying this way, surveying that way, deciding what was viable, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, what gets presented to the public is that's the one, take it or leave it, right? And you know, the DEP might be able to tweak it a little bit this way or that way to get around a watershed or a road crossing or something, but it shouldn't be the inevitability of the line, take it or leave it, right? There should be more deliberation around that. And what happens is the sense of that inevitability also creates a lot of strife, and certainly deals with issues like eminent domain, right? I mean, which produces significant opposition to pipelines. So are there alternative ways of being able to do that? And I think that we only know that by, you know, one of the fears I think of what we're seeing here is you know, industry tightening their grip on data because they're realizing that it just complicates things for them, you know, and that's not what I want to see. I want to see the you know, different, yeah.
I just wanted to ask a follow-up to that. You mentioned, so I'd be curious if you have a sense of what the time frame is we have here to work with in terms of pipelines and the build out, because I think one of the key issues is that as these get built, we're locking in an energy future that may not be the most sensible one. I mean, just from a climate perspective, a lot of other perspectives.
Right.
But do you have a sense of the window of time that, I mean, are these pipeline fights going to be around for the next 50 years, or is it more like 10 or 15 years? So I'd be curious at your perspective on that.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways you can cut that. Well, for one, you know, the current administration has committed to infrastructure, apparently, one day, and part of that initiative is pipelines. I mean, right up front. Pipelines east to west, west to east was, I think, the quote that came out of the Chief Economic Council. Now, so there's certainly momentum to build in the next year or two. And that's going to produce additional opposition, no doubt. I mean, you're seeing it, Sable Trail, Bayou Pipeline, Mountain Valley, Atlantic Sunrise. I mean, you name it. It's happening all over the Line 3 through Michigan, Trans-Pecos and Mexico, Texas border. I can just go on and on. At the same time, we're seeing all of this information that's starting to come out about how propped up, in particular, the unconventional oil and gas industry is right now by long-term loans that are starting to come due, by the fact that oil and gas prices are dropping through the floor, how unviable that industry may be. It could be the next great collapse as opposed to the housing crisis. We may see the oil and gas, collapse crisis. What good's a pipeline going to do if all of the companies that are trying to put money through it or try and put oil and gas through it go bankrupt in the next 10 years, right? Certainly if you start seeing decreasing demand as a result of renewables, which is on its own sort of independent trajectory regardless of what's happening in this industry. So there's a lot of factors and I don't know. But, and this is just my own claim, pipelines are Ponzi schemes, right? I mean, they are. It's like, we're going to build this awesome pipeline, get all these investors involved. We'll figure out later if we're actually going to get anything through it. Give us all your money. Promise it'll pay off, right? They're not paying off, right? And I think it's, like Sunoco is, the Mariner East is a really interesting case because they're now getting hammered by other pipeline building companies saying that you're making us look bad, right? And between that and the Rover pipeline, which is another project that is, Pennsylvania into Ohio, have racked up 800 violations since they started getting built. That's a lot, right? And so the investors are looking at that and saying, is this really a viable project? Do I want to invest in the next one? I think that that's also changing the game.
So apart from the future of the unconventional oil and gas industry, which, as we all know, energy futures are very difficult to predict, can you just talk a little about the political economics of what's going on more broadly? And I'm thinking of two things. One, the difference between New York and Pennsylvania.
Right.
And the other, the fact that Pennsylvania is a pretty conservative state, so presumably there is a fair amount of support for this among the populace as well. And so the pipeline issue could be a different issue than the unconventional gas economic issue more generally, right? So
right.
Can you just talk about how that plays out and what that means in terms of kind of longer term politics?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, many of you may be aware of the fact that New York State, 3 years ago now, banned hydraulic fracturing, right? That is a very narrow definition. Hydraulic fracturing is a very specific technological, implementation in oil and gas extraction. It doesn't say anything about, that ban doesn't say anything about pipelines, waste processing, compressor stations, you name it, right? All that stuff is still fair game. And so you are seeing a number of pipelines that are, taking gas from Pennsylvania and Ohio, sending it through New York State up into New England that has energy needs. But interestingly, New York State is a real flashpoint for this stuff because they've also, at the state level, shut down these projects by just denying watershed crossing permits too. Why are they able to do that? There's a different political climate in New York State, right? They're not I don't want to wash over this and say that New York is not deeply invested in, in energy past, because that's not true. If you go to the western part of the state and you look at, say, Cattaraugus County, it's like polka dots with conventional wells. There's just thousands of them, right? That's a different game than the unconventional oil and gas industry. But, you look at that ban, and it was mostly driven by, well, it's interesting we should talk about environmental impact statements because, millions of voters in the populated areas of the state, in addition to broad movement in the central and western part of the state that was passing all these local bans and moratoria. In fact, you can go to the Frac Tracker website and see the distribution of those maps. But with Cuomo, just sort of kept kicking it back to like, well, I want the the DOE, to, the Department of DEC, rather, environmental conservation, to do an environmental impact study, and then we'll have thousands of comments that come in on that, and the Department of Health is going to do another giant study, and then eventually it's like, well, the science says that I can't do this, right? But of course, there's all this political undertones to it. Same thing's happening with pipelines, and they're getting a lot of lawsuits that are going to the federal level right now as to whether or not it was fair of New York State to stop these pipelines. So there's political wins in New York State that are different, right? Now with Pennsylvania, of course, it is a very conservative state. One of the interesting things that I have seen, especially with the Mariner East, is that once Sunoco got its permits approved and they started building this thing, they don't have to say, we're going to start here and we're going to build a whole pipeline like this until it gets to Philadelphia, right? They can just start wherever they want and connect all the dots later, right? So where do you start? You start in the places that you're going to have friendly political wins. You start in the areas that have significant energy dependencies in which it's not going to be opposed, western parts of the state, for instance. And then you move into the areas where you're going to have harder times in building your projects. And this is one of the reasons why Mariner East is significantly built, but their stop points are the places where you have a more educated liberal base rather in places mostly east of Harrisburg. And so, but the process of building them out in these other places first produces that sense of inevitability. Like, we've already got a 90% built, just give us the other 10%, right? But if you build it first in the conservative areas or in the places that are energy friendly, then you start to develop that sense of inevitability and momentum. But yet you can see that it's not fair to characterize all of Pennsylvania as conservative. I mean, it's like two different worlds between eastern and western Pennsylvania. In fact, the environmental nonprofit community, I find it interesting when suddenly you have like a meeting somewhere in the middle of the state, and it's like Mars and Jupiter come together, and it's like, who are you? You're working on the same thing as us, And so I have found that to be really interesting, that you do have to pay attention to the minutiae of politics across counties, across municipalities, across demographics in a place like that. Okay. Thank you.
It's we're actually a couple minutes over time. So Kirk, first of all, thanks for a great presentation. Yeah. Thank you all for engaging in conversation. Please stick around if you want. You all haven't met everyone here, so continue to talk with Kirk. You can hang around a bit, right?
Yep.
So, and we'll see you next time, I hope. Okay, thanks, everybody.